to Madame Raven's. This way to the library. She's been expecting you.
The Old Shanty, Asia, Texas, by Michael Lockhart. I'm not sure anyone else experienced much on the old shanty that stood on the property where I live. I suspect that Ma knew or had experienced something. The place was built in 1933 and renovated in 1955. They added running water, a kitchen, and a bathroom. My folks bought it in 1975 when I was 11. It had belonged to the folks across the highway and to other locals before them. They were hoarders before hoarding was popular. So the place was full of stuff, mostly junk. I found a decrepit stuffed toy cat, black of course, that was just the right size for G.I. Joe to hunt or be eaten by. Yep, I was the opposite of scrawny, but still a nerd. I discovered the joys of the storage area in what the previous occupants had used as a dining room. Post-renovation, no idea what it was before that. Maybe it was always just an extension of the living room. The only separation was an open space delineated by two short walls and a support wall that ran overhead. More on that in a moment. The storage space was up high and had two openings with no doors. I was a climber, and that's where I found the only item of interest in that junk-riddled lair. So it became my escape place when we went there for weekends. It had a little fireplace and a few glass and porcelain doorknobs. Poor Ma had a second house to maintain. We got the well to pump for a short time, but could never get the sulfur to dissipate. So she did all that on water we collected in a rain barrel. We had to carry jugs of potable water for cooking and drinking. Dad tore out the bathroom. He hated indoor toilets. Never mind the rest of us. Eye roll. We had lots of gatherings for the extended family and friends. My last Samhain Halloween before I left for the army, we made a haunted house and then told bonfire stories. And my brother Larry led revelers into the woods on a moonlit, scary story trek. I played the role of a killer and stalked them. We had a pre-planned signal, and when Larry reached the point in the tale, he switched off the flashlight. I convinced a girl cousin to let out a blood-curdling scream. Then I jumped into the circle, wearing a monster mask and waving around a stick, just as Larry turned on the flashlight. Very fun. Now, as far as I can find, no one ever died in the house. One older man may have died elsewhere on the property, but a natural cause case, nothing violent or unexpected. Yet the place was always spooky. At one of our gatherings a few years before the big party, the rest of the party left to visit a local beer joint at the behest of Dad and Uncle Carl, Mom's brother. You met him in Will o' the Wisp. In life, he was her younger brother. I was busy with the new book, The Amityville Horror. No kidding. It was popular at the time. I platzed out on the screen porch and put a lamp on the window to the house. The place had electricity, scary and dangerous electricity with 1955 wiring, done by who knows. The breakers were prone to flipping us off when we overloaded it. You know, maybe using two lights in the icebox. Maybe I was simply primed, all along in the dark in a house that was creepy. Back then, no neighbors are close, and the highway had little traffic on weekends. Just drunk drivers, like Dad and Uncle Carl. My cousin's new girlfriend had left her little foo-foo poodle with me, but she would not deign to leave the house to sit out on the porch. Until she did, she was somewhere in the dark in the back of the structure. I have a suspicion about which room. I heard her yelp, and then she came tearing out of the house and slammed into the screen door. Fortunately, it was a sticker, and she didn't have enough mass to move it. I sat up and she decided that even curling up beside a dumbass kid was better company than shivering in fear alone. The dog never stepped inside the house for the rest of the weekend. I suspect that she found what I later called the hateful room. It had been a bedroom and still was. It was nearest the bathroom that was now storage space. It had once had a door between it and the front bedroom, but after Dad closed off that portal, something changed. It was not a good place to be. It had the only access to the ceiling, which was sturdy and well constructed, as I rediscovered decades later when I deconstructed it. At the time, it was simply a space that occasionally felt unwelcoming, as though any occupant was an intruder. Whatever caused that feeling had a peculiar dislike for me. I slept in it a few times and awakened with bruises after awful nightmares. We didn't think much of it. When I was young, I was an active sleeper, tended to laugh out loud, call out, and thrash, even fight in my sleep. Yet there was something different about that room. I barked my shin almost every time I went into that space, especially near the closet, which happened to be beneath my space on the dining room side of the wall. I was stung by a wasp, and it ballooned my right thumb pad beyond any other sting or bite I'd had to that point in my life. In my later teens, I went up with my high school friends, a pair of brothers. We were there to hunt deer, but it was too cold, and we were too lazy to get up early enough to find anything but tracks. Instead, we spent the day goofing off and shooting stuff. We were there to hunt deer, but it was too cold, and we were too lazy to find anything but tracks. Instead, we spent the day goofing off and shooting stuff. One of them brought an old cheap action figure, a knockoff of G.I. Joe, and we gave him some adventures, by the end of which he was pretty shredded and bullet-ridden. So we gave him a burial at sea in the old well. The entire day was a sort of ritual to shed childhood in preparation for adult life. On the last morning, Clifton got up before dawn. It was his turn to cook. It was the coldest day of the trip, so we had the fireplace going, and the little wood stove my folks had added in the old dining room, now extension of the living room. We never ate in that house. Weird. I just realized that. We always ate outside. Ma cooked outside. Odd. Clifton had slept by their fireplace, and his brother, Sterling, was on the couch beside the wood stove. Clifton plugged in the little oven, and we brought in at some point with lights. It was, alas, too much for the poor wiring, and the breaker flipped us off. I finally had to crawl out from under the covers and tell Clifton it was okay and he could stop cussing. Not that I cared. It was the volume of the expletives rather than their nature. I pulled the drop chain and switched off the living room bulb, then reset the breaker, and then there was light. We headed for the kitchen to see if I could help, but saw Sterling, his face drained and eyes bulging. I asked what the matter was, and he simply pointed to a clock that now rested on the floor on the other side of the stove. It was normally hung on the wall above the icebox. Yes, the icebox was in the old dining room. The place was a dump. Guess which wall? Yep, the one that held my crawl space on one side and the hateful room closet on the other. Just saying. We eventually got it out of the Sterl the Mighty, strongest dude I ever met who didn't exercise, that he'd seen or dreamt he'd seen the clock come off the wall and roll across the opening between the living room and the dining room and come to a rest where it was. It didn't fall. It just came off the wall, disappeared behind the icebox, then reappeared again as it rolled. After that, I didn't go up there often. Dad had a stroke and wasn't able to drink anymore, so there wasn't much reason to go. Besides, I was a full-on high school turd with no life and nowhere to really go, but I managed to find other things to do, mainly sitting around the house and read. My folks always encouraged that vice. They were readers too, so it was our family time, even though we did it in separate rooms. When I moved back home to Texas, I ended up working for the state. There were no offices in this area and no decent jobs at other types of departments. So I paid taxes and occasionally visited the old shanty, as I'd come to call it. Something about the old house that was rarely visited and had fallen into disrepair makes the place resentful, as though it was an older relative dumped into a nursing home and forgotten. Dad hadn't been able to visit in the years after Ma died. Then he followed her. I just like roaming the property, the woods. Then I went inside the old shanty. I'd been up a few times, but barely crossed the threshold. The place smelled of rot and mold. I went in to explore for the first time in April 1999. It was a warm spring day, and I enjoyed pushing open the front door. I still have it in the storage building. It had a big glass panel that I was always afraid would break. I made it in and immediately felt something was wrong. No senses engaged, just the gut. I glanced into the front bedroom. No problem. Then I strode towards the opening between the living room and the dining room. I was hit with a chill, a profound cold that emanated from the inside out. At the frame, I struck an invisible wall, not like boinking one's nose on a real surface, more like walking into a space that has become suddenly solid. I could not move forward from one room to the other. I stepped back and the cold lessened very slightly. I left by the front door and climbed into my truck and went to visit the cemetery, about 5 miles up the road where my parents and Dad's family are all buried. When I returned, I used the back door that led to the space between the kitchen and where the old bathroom wall had been. The hateful room was ahead, but the door was mostly closed. I peeked around the corner, through the door that led from the kitchen to the dining room. Kitchen, nothing. I stayed warm, then I left the property and drove back towards Houston. The chill finally left when I drove from the property and onto the highway home. I learned later to enter the house through the back door. There are many cultures. Sorry, this is me breaking in. There are many cultures in rural communities worldwide. Terry Pratchett has talked about it in the Ramparts, that people only entered and left through the front door as newlyweds and left as corpses. Everybody else went through the back door. Anyway, sorry. My little aside it reminded me of. Sorry, Michael. I visited the hateful room, one of the bravest, most idiotic things I've ever done to bring in a little aluminum ladder from an old garage and climb up to stick my head through the opening into the ceiling. I used the handle of an ancient broom to rattle the space and hopefully scare off any critters. I surveyed the space with my flashlight. It looked and felt empty. Some part of me had hoped to find a mason jar filled with valuable old coins or some other treasure. There were only one pine straw nest and bird droppings. Maybe rats and mice had made some of the nests and messes. I saw the ceiling was solid and made of lumber, but the roof was a simple cage of 2x4s that held up a pyramid of tin over the original rooms and a slope for the added-on spaces. I was often stationed in places that made visits impractical. Besides, what would I do? I don't hunt, and I wasn't about to stay in the now thoroughly critter-invaded interior space. It was overgrown and messy and reeked of mold and guano. The highway department had started to widen the roadway that is now so thoroughly trafficked. The workers used the front of my property to park. It was no problem until my wagon wheels and wood stove disappeared. I put up signs and made some calls, and the disappearances halted. I wrote no trespassing in chalk on the front door. It was inside the screen porch area and out of the weather. I signed it with my initials. The next time I returned, my dad's initials were scrawled on it with the words, "You too." Maybe that was one of my relatives playing a joke, but on that day, the hateful room gave off such an evil vibe that I once again fled the premises. I came back on another weekend and shot up the place. Didn't do much good, but it was excellent shooting practice for indoor scenarios, except that despite my high-dollar hearing protection, I was left with a headache and dizziness. Physical, not mental. When retirement loomed, I began to clear the space and figure out where to build or place a structure. I did not want to use the same space as the old shanty. I found some locals who ran a land clearing business on the sides, and they cleared the brush, some of the trees, and the old garage. It was a goof. I never took a proper look inside, too snaky, and lost some cool junk. They wouldn't touch the old shanty, said it had asbestos cladding. It did not, I checked. There was a drought that autumn, so they couldn't burn the brush piles. They didn't cut the trees that were where I planned to place my new living room. They were derelicts. They claimed that their equipment kept breaking, and they kept having minor incidents. I figured it was just an excuse to do a half-assed work at full price. I learned. I began to strip and deconstruct the old shanty. It took a few years. I was only able to come up on Saturdays and not on every one of those. I did it all with hand tools, mostly a sledge and pry bar. I kept having little accidents, getting hurt, getting splinters, despite wearing gloves and not necessarily handling wood pieces. The stench and the cold feelings fought me, but I persisted. I had a burn pile out back and destroyed most of the place as I went. Larry helped on a few occasions, but I did most of it. I finally determined to break the hearth, to disrupt whatever it was. I had a long, heavy pry bar, and on a whim, I started ramming through the back of the fire pit from the inside of the house. The wall would keep the bricks from falling towards us, and I hoped that they would pile around the base. On the proverbial third strike, the structure collapsed. I felt an odd sensation, and just before it crumbled, I dropped the pry bar and jumped back from it. I pushed in between Larry and the raining bricks. Not that they were raining on us. I was more concerned about the flying end of the pry bar that was counter-levered by the sudden weight on one end. It didn't cure the problem, but I gained some respite. I removed the windows and gave them to crafting friends from work. I kept the cool doorknobs, working with them into other projects, but I burned almost every stick of wood. I've only recently organized the tin pieces, and I'm still working on the brick pile that was the fireplace. The old shanty fought me every step of the way. It contained a ridiculous number of nails. I later discovered that it was due to untreated wood that tended to warp in the high humidity of the piney woods. I took down 3 of the outer walls in the porch and completely removed the 1955 kitchen-bathroom spaces and roof. I took out 3 of the 4 walls, expecting to be crushed at any moment. The front wall held up the entire ceiling roof structure on its own. I didn't know what to do, so for my birthday in 2016, Larry volunteered to help. We attached our trucks, one to each side of the remaining wall, via the 2 remaining windows. We had long chains, and on my signal, we drove in opposite directions. It tore right through the walls, between the outer edges of the windows and the walls. The inner portions, along with the front door, remained standing, and the roof still stood proud and level. So I went to work with metal poles and the long pry bar, maybe a good pint, to mention that our dad had collected many old junk cars and trucks some appliances, and all kinds of scrap metal. Still working on the piles. They're all over the former trails through the woods. I have to recut those first. One of my post-retirement hobbies. Now, anyone would think that the thing would simply fall towards the heavy ceiling roof and onto the remnants of the floor. The best we could do was get it to sag in that direction. Over the next few weeks, it settled. I started pulling tin from the roof and beating the infrastructure to pieces so I could get at more of it without climbing. I finally had to climb. The roof was much closer to the ground, but I still managed to fall from it and aggravate my lower back issues, and severely bruise my knee. Felt creaky for a couple of weeks now. Now, I was on a steady surface. I was braced. I didn't move in any sudden or forceful manner. Yet I was pushed from that roof. I was able to turn the fall into a jump and clear the pile of tine on the ground, but not some other detritus. That's what my knee struck. I fought the splinters, the stabs from nails, and the sudden shift of the roof, then the ceiling, then the floor, all the while expecting millions of venomous snake bites to erupt from below. They didn't now the space is cleared. Still stinky on occasion, but I've planted some trees over the old burn piles. I carted off most of the crud in my big wheelbarrow. The tree that stood where I planned to have my living room. I got a chainsaw for that. Larry helped me cut it and the pile and the resulting logs and brush around the stump. A log fell off from a perfectly solid resting place and gave me a hairline fracture on my left shin. Didn't do the space between the tibia and fibula much good either. When the fire was done, the stump still remained, charred but solid, so I started to dig around the base. I burned some more, then again, finally managed to get rid of the thing and plugged the hole later when I put in the foundation dirt. Before I could build anything, one of my huge pines died and we had to cut it. It was too big for a couple of amateurs, but we managed to aim it where we intended, and it fell into place. Another few have since died, all in the area just west of the old shanty. Not all pines, and every one of them gave me a tremendous fight. No YouTube video tricks could overcome the things. I ended up with a prefab metal home and another separate room from the same manufacturer. The main home build arrived before I was done with the old shanty. The trees died mostly before that. Now that I'm here full time, I often walk the woods. I constantly trip and often fall. Stubs of Japan that I've cut over the years seem to suddenly appear and bark my shins. Both of them are healing from recent bloody wounds. I still catch a faint whiff of the moldy stench from where the old shanty was. I don't like walking over the site of the hateful room. Every chore I do on the property seems to take forever, and I constantly drop things. I've been tripped or pushed down my stairs several times. I've found that if I roll with it, I can usually escape unharmed. Maybe I'm just getting too old to walk. At 57? I've been burned countless times, and I've had enough bruises to kill a bear. I have, from the beginning, heard weird noises in the place. I don't mean the shifting and settling. Those are familiar. I mean the sounds of voices. Usually in groups. No menacing tones, just gathered into a group. Always just out of range of comprehension, yet clearly human voices. Maybe I'm going stir-crazy, but it doesn't feel that way. They just exist. No agenda, no more cold spots, and the hateful vibes have been reduced to a general unfriendliness. I don't point to any spirits of dead mortals. I can feel that there is something older. Spirits of the land, what the Teutonic and Scandinavian people called land wights. Not sure what the first locals called them. Anyway, That's my haunted house and land story. There are plenty more details, but I've rambled on for a long time, and it is truly a ramble. I found a mundane explanation for why my mailboxes were vandalized. An overloaded truck that used the shoulder to stay out of traffic traveled between properties on either side of me. That one was getting weird, but I had always assumed a human element. I think that the grove may have helped. It feels like a safe space. Hopefully, other listeners will come up with something more interesting. All the best. Erg. So quoth this raven. That is very fascinating, indeed. Thank you very much, Michael, for the story, and I hope you all have a lovely weekend. I still can't promise 3 videos a week, but I will do my very best. Have a lovely weekend, my darlings. Thank you so kindly for stopping by my chateau, my darlings. It does mean so much to me. Please, if you have not subscribed, as many of you have not, please do so. Give me a like so I know what you would like to hear. And comment. I always love to read your comments. And special thanks to my Patreon and membership supporters. Ciao, darlings.